Okay, that's odd. Oh, I know what's going on. So, this is my daughter's fault. So, she has a Google Home Mini in her room. And in order to wake her up, I broadcast rooster sounds on Spotify to her. And for whatever reason, when I took my headphone out and put it away because it's not working, my Spotify on my PC decided it was going to pick up on that particular sound. So it's entirely her fault. But yes, I'll blame my poor dearie for everything. Okay.
You definitely made us wake up.
Oh yeah, there we go. All right. I was like, what is barnyard sounds? Must diagnose. Okay. All right, here we go. Ooh, too loud, too loud, too loud. Okay. All right. So let's jump in here. We don't have honestly, we have no content left to cover. So I'm gonna do I got one slide, and then we can leave the rest basically for just Q&A. Anything you want to know about any of the content, any exam questions you have, any of that stuff. I'm happy to answer any questions. And obviously, if you're here, you can just pop up your hand and ask a question, or ask it in the Slido here. Okay, so I'm gonna shut the door. I don't know why it bothers me when the door's open. It just does. Very nice. All right. Okay. So let's I guess we ended off last class talking about Gen Z and mental health, right? And we're gonna jump into this topic a lot more throughout the course, especially towards the kind of final third of the course, talking about mental health, because it's a big question when it comes to Gen Z. Okay. And then this is our last bit of content before the exam. And I should just remind you, and I'll move the slides out of the folder, is that education and family are not going to be on the midterm, right? We're going to talk about them starting on Wednesday. So you don't have to learn that content by yourself. Don't worry about it, right? I'm not like you need to go and learn those 2 units by yourself because I didn't get time to teach them in class and they're on the midterm. No. The midterm, we're going to stop at this slide, right? So this is it for midterm 1 content. And frankly, there's a ton, right? I was writing questions yesterday and I'm like, I got too many questions. So like we're definitely not short of content, and we'll just bump families and education over by one over into the next midterm, and I have been meaning to trim those up a little bit anyway, so I will trim them up a little bit so we can go faster and kind of get back on pace, because all the content I added meant we only got through 2 units, but I hopefully think it's worth it, because I think it sets the stage for understanding what's going on. I mean, if you've taken any other classes with me, especially SOC of religion, I love the long setup for a class, like extremely long in terms of theories and concepts and all of that. So, all right. Gen Z. One of the things that Twenge notes in our last kind of bit of information, that I think is important, is that Gen Z is ultimately quite pessimistic, right? So if we noted that millennials were quite optimistic, right? Gen Z has sort of flipped that coin over, right, and they're on the dark side of that particular equation. And this goes, down to basic kind of social solidarity levels. And this potentially represents a big kind of social problem, and something that, say, governments and leaders of major institutions are probably going to have to grapple with when it comes to Gen Z, since, it is now the generation moving into that emerging adulthood in large numbers, right? The oldest of them are just kind of, entering their 30s. This is going to be a big, important cohort going forward, and they're very pessimistic, right? All right, so what does Gene Twenge find? 6 in 10 say they disagree with the statement that America, and obviously we just have numbers here for the US, that America is a fair society where everyone can get ahead, right? So 60% of Gen Zers don't think America is ultimately fair. And obviously that's a big problem. Now, one of the things that Twenge notes is as economic inequality rises, right, and this has happened, in the past, when economic inequality rises, you do tend to get breakdowns in social solidarity like this. If it seems like no matter how hard you work, you can't get ahead, you end up in this kind of situation of a low trust society. But low trust societies are problematic, right? They're bad in the sense that then people don't feel like they can get ahead. They don't trust major institutions. They start to kind of doubt everything, and that ends up being a really, really big problem, right? Because people start to feel disconnected from society. If you want to think in Durkheim's terms, right, you're talking anomie on a mass scale with Gen Z, a feeling of disconnection and sort of directionlessness, because they just don't know who they can trust, right? And they don't think they can trust, basically major institutions, right? 3/4 of Gen Zers. This is an astonishing number. I would, before reading this book, I would have been like, no, this is got to be like a third, right, at most. 3/4 of Gen Zers think we should tear society down and start again, right? That society is so rotten at its core that basically, we should tear it down and completely start again. Now, again, like this happens in like revolutionary moments. You probably would have found this in like Russian society in like 1916, right? That everything is, especially amongst elites, right? That society is so rotten that you can't trust anything. And this kind of idea, I think probably driven a little bit by some conflict theory, kind of Marxian sort of thinking that seeped its way in along with that postmodernism. That society is so corrupt, it's oppressor oppressed, and it has to be torn down. But again, 3/4 of your, youngest kind of measurable generational cohort thinking that, society is so terrible that we should tear it down and start again is a big problem. 4 in 10, so this is an American question again. 4 in 10 Zoomers believe that the founders were better described as villains than heroes, right? So this, I think, is not, again, I'm less surprised by this, given the kind of discourses around, the founding, around slavery, and the treatment of Black people in the U.S. historically that have come up, right? And the kind of movement to reevaluate history. I suspect you would find similar kind of numbers in Canada if you talked about, the John A. Macdonalds of the world. Only a little bit more than a third said they're very proud to be American. So that is obviously not a good thing either. I guess if you're not proud to be American, it's either good or bad. It's just a social statistic, but it's problematic, right? If you're not proud to be an American, Obviously that connection between your nation state and you has kind of broken down. And again, that's going to leave you feeling very disconnected from society. Only a slim majority have a positive view of capitalism, so they're doubting the kind of basic economic system they live under, right? And again, I think you've seen in Gen Z some bubbling up of a sort of neo-Marxian kind of movement and thought, right, that we should go to socialism or communism or something. Tend to perceive discrimination and perceive an external locus of control. And this one, I know this sounds a little bit abstract. When we get to the mental health stuff, this shows up in a really weird way. So when we talk about an external locus of control, right, from a psychological perspective, it basically means that you're not in control of your own life, right? That there are external forces that are in control of your life and that there's essentially nothing that you can do to change your fate, right? That you are essentially sort of powerless. External locus of control is not a particularly healthy psychological kind of adaptation, because if you think you have no control over your life, you tend to get kind of hopeless and angry, right? Now you see this in a really weird split. I'll talk about it later in the course, and this is becoming incredibly well established in kind of the social science, and I've seen a lot of writing about it. Particularly people who are either socially progressive or describe themselves as socially liberal, have a greater likelihood of having an external locus of control, right? Where they don't think that they can affect their own life, for the better, right? They think the system is so stacked against them. Outside forces are controlling their life in such a way as to make it impossible for them to succeed. You see this much less with conservatives, right? So what you also see along with this is rates of depression, anxiety, and other kind of mental illnesses are considerably higher amongst liberal women particularly, than they are amongst conservatives. And I'll show you the statistics once we get into the mental health unit and the charts. It's really interesting because a lot of it seems to have to do with whether you think you're in control of your own life. If you think you are, which for ideological reasons conservatives seem to think more so, you have more sense of agency, less anxiety, right? You think you can change your life. And so this, external locus of control ends up being a big problem. And we see it in the Gen Z data all over the place, right? The more socially progressive you are, the more likely you are to have an external locus of control. And, the less, and then it kind of drives all of these other things, right? Okay, so, I promise, I'm giving you like the highlights for later. Unlike the movie trailer where I show you all the good parts of the movie, except this trailer has taken 4 weeks or so. Is it 4 or 3? Is this 3, 4? I don't even know anymore. I can't tell. What is time? Okay, so what do we have on our charts there? And then I'll just explain this, and then we'll kind of go from there. So founders, that top chart. Founders as villains, right? And you can see the differences generationally, like almost nobody in the silent generation thought the founders were villains, and it goes up generationally. American society is unfair. Again, you get that growing sense from generation to generation. Not surprising that the boomers wouldn't feel that way, or the silents, right? They lived and they grew up in an era of incredible prosperity and opportunity, and they've lived their whole lives kind of in that space for the most part. And then significant change is needed, right? You get up to Gen Z, right, above, 3/4, right, 75%. Millennials are not trailing far behind, and then like the only generations that are under the 50% line are your silents and boomers. Again, more invested in society, they're older, they have more at stake with the kind of status quo. So some of that makes sense. Yeah, hard to have hope for the world and wonder if purpose to life, if there's a purpose to life given the world situation. And you see it, right, it kind of takes a spike up. In the early 2000s, it's sort of at its low. That's when millennials are coming into this sample, right? Millennials, again, pretty optimistic, right? Compared to Gen Z over here, yeah, they're having a little bit of trouble. Now again, it's not historically high, right? There's some. This is a very normal-ish looking chart, right? Lots of bumps and bumps. Millennials weirdly were like super optimistic, and you could actually see it on this chart. It's kind of funny, right? When I said millennials were optimistic, they were optimistic, and the graph shows it. Obviously, Gen Z is returning to kind of probably Gen X levels of pessimism in some way, but it looks like this graph is continuing to rise to some extent. And the last one, right? Expect a professional job, expect graduation or professional degree, or graduate or professional degree, or expect to own more than parents, right? They're all kind of moving in the direction of pessimism, right? Away from a sort of optimism, right? And definitely, hey, look, millennials again, kind of optimistic. Cheery generation, you can see it on the graph. And Gen Z, it's kind of on its way down. They expect that their situation is going to be worse. You know, they're going to have a hard time finding a job. Now, whether this reflects reality or not is not the question, right? These are their this is their sense of the world. So they're scared about their future economically, which again bears out what Twenge said in iGen. Okay. So that's it for the content, right? So, I mean, and we went through practice questions last time and giving you a sense of what the questions look like. So basically I've used like 18 minutes. The rest of the time is yours to ask questions, right? I'm happy to do a Q&A on anything, any of the content so far, any questions about the exam. Like I said, you can raise your hand if you're in the room. If you're not, you know, you can use the Slido to ask questions. Yeah.
So for Gen Z and their like pessimism and all that, is this something that was apparent in another generation before? And if it was, like, how did that end up?
I mean, I think probably the closest correlate is Gen X, right? Where Gen X had, it's hard to, there's not exact parallels because they're quite different, right? And they grow up with different inputs. Gen X had this sort of weird situation where they start to come into the into the working world and the adult world, kind of towards the middle part of the 1970s, right? That generation, more kind of like early 1960s, starts to be aware and be adolescent, right? Middle part of the 1970s, especially in America, that's a really, really bad time, right? This is a period, this is the presidency of Jimmy Carter, right? And the events leading up to that and the end of like the Nixon era and then into Carter. It's a period, well, for example, with runaway inflation, right? I didn't talk about the economic history, but I could have. It's a period of what's called stagflation, right? Where, kind of like now, actually, we have economic stagnation, right? Where economic growth is really slow and inflation is running really, really hot. Now, even hotter than it is today, right? And you had things like interest rates at the time being in the 18 to 20%. So, you know, if you wanted to buy a house, you better have a lot of money because every payment you're paying 18 to 20% in terms of interest payments, right? So, I mean, I remember my parents talking about this when they bought their first house in the 70s. You know, they were in the situation, or was it the first or second house? I can't remember. They were in this kind of weird situation where, you know, they ended up at the end of their first 5-year term and they had paid something like $18 off the principal because everything else had gone to interest, right? So they sold a bunch of stuff, took all the money they could and paid off as much of the loan as they could. But it was a period, and like oil prices went really, really high. So energy prices raged out of control because of what's called the Arab oil embargoes, because of the kind of a disagreement with the United States over the state of Israel. It really is like right now. Maybe history is cyclical. Who knows? I'm not a big fan of cyclical versions of history, but whatever. And so, like, it's a really tough economic situation. The boomers, also being such a big generational cohort and having already moved into the workforce, have just taken up the whole workforce, right? And there's no space for Gen X to get into the workforce. And so they're super pessimistic, right? I mean, they coined, and we'll talk about this when we talk about work, they coined the term the McJob, right? Because with the boomers taking up all the good jobs, Gen X is sort of relegated to what they call McJobs, right? Which are these crappy, poor opportunity, you know, low quality jobs that they don't really want to be in, but they have no other choice. So yeah, they end up being really pessimistic. And in some ways, right, you can see some of the parallels. Millennials are also a really big generation who've now moved into the workforce. And, you know, from your perspective as Gen Z, are probably occupying a lot of the jobs that you would probably want as well. And trust me, it took us a long time to get here, so we're not getting out anytime soon unless you kill us, which, given your tear it all down, is a distinct possibility. The guillotines might come out at any point. Yeah.
So when we're looking at these generational trends, is there any way to make kind of like estimates as like where the trends are leading Gen Z where it's different than before because like lower like drug usage and alcohol usage and smoking and having babies and all that like, but yet there's still that like anomie of like we think society sucks. Like, do you think there's like any way you can see like where that's going to lead?
So where,
As
I mean,
as we become like, more adult.
predicting the future is, I may have said this in other classes that you've taken with me. Predicting the future is a mug's game, right? And here, the sociologists, favorite phrase is if current trends continue. The problem being that current trends almost never continue, right? Like what's happening now, might change drastically, right? There might be a war, a world war, hopefully not, or something else that intervenes. But if things continue going the way they are, you're looking at a very unhappy generation, a generation that will probably do okay materially, right, based on other trends. Like they're probably going to be all right, maybe not as well off as the boomers, and probably not as early, right? So because the boomers could get a great job at like 19 with a high school diploma, and Gen Z can get a great job at 25 with a master's degree. A lot of that stuff is going to be delayed. So it's going to look like, oh, Gen Z is behind until it's not, right? Until like millennials, it's like, oh, millennials are behind on home ownership and wealth until they're not, right? Because they got into the workforce later, did more education, things look a little different than other generations. The mental health numbers are really hard to anticipate, right? Like Gen X looked really terrible in their teen years, right? In the adult years, they kind of perked up a little bit. A lot of that is world events. A lot of that is macroeconomics. Very basic question. And so it's really, really hard to predict. But I mean, if things continue going the way they are, and I just saw the total fertility rate for Canada in 2022, 1.33 children per woman. Kind of initial estimates for 2024, for 2023, it looks like somewhere between 1.17 and 1.22. What is going to end up happening is Gen Z is going to have essentially no children, right? You're going to have, you could see the next generational cohort, without immigration being half the size, roughly, of Gen Z, which means a really small generational cohort. Oh my God, you're asking such a complicated question. Like I don't even know how to begin answering it. You're probably going to bear the burden of all the older generations above you suddenly becoming old and needing a ton of medical services and healthcare, which means your services are going to suck. There's not going to be money for your children's education probably, which is going to make you feel kind of crappy. It's already kind of that way as the boomers are aging out for millennials. It's like we've cut funding for education, and it's all being sucked up by aging boomers, partially because they vote and you don't. So keep that in mind. Politicians will go where the money is and where the votes are. So it's probably going to look really bad in some ways until all the boomers are dead. Unfortunately, they're going to live a good chunk of them into their 90s and 100s, so it's still going to be a while. The oldest of them are like in their late 70s. So it's probably going to be pretty tough economically in some ways. Your tax burden's going to go up. You're going to have less children. You're going to feel more disconnected because the fewer children you have, the less connected you seem. You hate institutions. So you're going to be like, screw that, I'm on my own, which also doesn't make you feel good. So if I was going to guess, I would just draw like a big black circle, and that would be my prediction for Gen Z. But I'm a pessimist by nature. You have a follow-up question to my horrifying predictions?
Will this put, or will the government feel pressure as our generation gets older if we're like having a lack of faith in institutions and not having children?
Maybe. I don't know. I mean, and Canada's solution typically has been to just bring in more immigrants, right? I mean, look, I could see a potential world because I've read enough dystopian science fiction where, like, in the future, the Canadian government, led by Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau Jr., probably not him, but whoever his kid is, I can't remember their names and I don't care, is like, in order to save Canada from extinction, we've now banned birth control and now all women are required to have 5 children. But again, I've read a lot of dystopian science fiction. So like, this is like, Oh, what is it? That stupid Margaret Atwood novel that everyone talks about, which is really not a very good book. But yeah, The Handmaid's Tale. Yeah, the one that they put Alexis Bledel in the TV version. But you know, that kind of thing is a possibility as birth rates go lower. But who knows, right? We might just stop existing too. Who knows? Hey, demographic this is totally random. Demographic predictions for the year 2150 suggest there'll be as many humans in 2150 as there were in 1945, based on current like projections for kind of population declines. About 2.5 to 3 billion. So you could see the global population by like the middle part of next century. And don't worry, I'll be dead, so I don't care. You know, basically go back to where it was after the Second World War. So before the giant jump to like 9 billion people. Tops out about 9 billion and then goes, oh, if current trends continue, which they never do. I'm going to answer this one question for the person. It is an open book exam. You can do it anytime from midnight to 11:59 on Monday. You don't have to come to class, though I will pop in and see if anyone's here. If you want to ask questions, I'll be here. You can shoot me an email. I'll try to keep up with it as best as I can during the day. But yeah, it's open book. So you can use anything. All right. Sorry, your question.
What about birth rate in developing nations like Africa? How does that?
So depending on the developing nation, a lot of African nations are. Why do I know this? I don't know. Yeah, I mean, okay, it's just a lot of, you know, like, why do I know birth rates in random places? A lot of African countries are kind of still on the upswing, right? And so by 2070, like the last kind of quarter of the 21st century, about a quarter of people on Earth will be in Africa, right? Everywhere else, and this includes Latin America, like developing countries in Latin America, in the Indo-Pacific region, Indian subcontinent, China, you know, the West, Central Asia, with a few exceptions, like Afghanistan, you know, was one, and Afghanistan, Pakistan are exceptions. But pretty much everywhere else, we're seeing below replacement fertility. And there are African countries that are starting to trend in that direction as well, where they've sort of peaked out, you know, at about 3.8 children per woman. And it's now, you know, they're now down in like the 2.4 range, and it's dropped really quickly. So it looks like everybody's kind of trending in the same direction. Outside of like, honestly, it's maybe like 10, kind of like Nigeria, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Palestinian territories, which have really, really high birth rates, but it's a small population, so that doesn't impact globally in the same way. There's a couple of others, and I just can't remember them off the top of my head. They're mostly in Africa, but like pretty much all of the, say, like North Africa and Middle East is all trending way down. Even places like Iran, which had pretty high fertility rates for a long time, it's now trending in the direction of like 1.4 children per woman. And so like everywhere is trending down. And like even like, you know, countries that are quite underdeveloped, like Latin American countries like Guatemala, you'd think they would have high birth rates, but it's actually kind of crashing. So you've asked a lot of, does anyone else have, I don't want to answer only Mia's questions. Oh yeah, please, sorry, at the back. I'll come back to you, Mia, I promise. Yeah. Yeah. So I mean, essentially, you know, if you think of the end of the Cold War, it's not, I mean, millennials are just kind of continuing that trend towards consumerism that started with the boomers. Gen X is more materialistic. We see that in their kind of life philosophy question. Millennials just kind of continue that. What the end of the Cold War did was sort of take out any question that there was an alternative kind of economic system, right? It's like, what is there other than capitalism driven by consumerism, right? Kind of nothing. Because suddenly it's like, well, all of those alternate kind of social organizations failed, right? Particularly the Soviet Union, right? The Soviet Union with its collapse, it's taken us, like, if you want to go in like the much too triumphalist Francis Fukuyama sort of direction, right? He said we've reached the end of history, right? And by that he didn't mean that we were all going to die. That is coming later, but that basically liberal democracy and market capitalism had won the day, and there were no competing economic or political systems left, right? So that, now, I mean, this is prior to really the big rise of China as a sort of what you might call an authoritarian capitalist state, kind of picks up, and Russia coming back in the late 90s, early 2000s. But through that period of the 1990s, right, it's like there is no other system. So it's like, buy till you die, if that makes sense. I'll put it in crude ways. Okay, no other questions, Mia?
There's two generations, like Gen X, Gen Z, like, are they a Western phenomenon, or do they apply to South Asians?
So they're all okay. So when we talk about, and the reason I focus like on the U.S. and Canada, because it's super relevant to us because that's where we live, right? I mean, you saw similar things across Western Europe, right? The experience is a little bit different, and then like in some ways you saw similar generational cohorts with similar, especially technologically formative experiences anywhere that's kind of developed. Now, if you went to like sub-Saharan Africa, it doesn't really make any sense because there, some of the technologies didn't penetrate in the same way, right? They didn't get into those societies as uniformly and evenly as they did in the West, right? Cell phones were not adopted in the same way in say, a lot of sub-Saharan Africa. They've started now, and now you're getting greater internet penetration. But let's say like the PC in a lot of ways, or personal computers of any kind, never got picked up in those societies as much. So it makes sense really of kind of the West, and you could probably throw in Central and Eastern Europe into these kind of generational cohorts. Now again, let's say like if you were in Moscow in 1991, that experience for millennial Russians is going to be very different than it was for, say, Canadians, right? For them, it was a time of horror, depression, rampant crime, poverty, and all of these sorts of things. So they would have, the same technological inputs, but because the social situation was different, they experienced it completely differently. Which, by the way, is why we have a really hard time understanding why Russians act the way they do, right? And why they're, the war in Ukraine, we're like, I don't understand what their motivation is. A lot of that is in that 90s hinge point, that it was so different from a socio-political and economic perspective for them than almost anyone else, right? So we can talk about similar, like you could talk about millennial Russians, but you'd have to make adjustments for thinking about their different generational cohorts. Across the West, though, it's pretty uniform. And you probably throw in Australia and New Zealand into that mix as well. Everybody had kind of the same inputs, slightly different cultural experiences, right? Because Australians would have been watching slightly different TV shows, more accents and kangaroos, I presume. I don't know if they actually film kangaroos in appreciable numbers. But similar kind of inputs and generational kind of outlines. Again, you might see slightly different experiences, and maybe the demographic kind of bubble, say in Europe, was a little bit smaller, which it was, than in the US. But overall, right, kind of similar profile. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so like Gen Z, boomers can be really across like any nation as a generation, it could be called that. So I was like, even like for boomers, was the boom really in like North America, or was it like all over the world?
You saw it in the West, you saw it in the Soviet Union as well, right? The Soviets, yeah, and it was a weird one for the Soviets, and again, looked a little different, but you saw it pretty uniformly across Europe and North America and like New Zealand, Australia. Again, not always the same intensity, but generally it's there, right? I don't know how many Kiwis were born in that period. It's probably not that many because there's not that many New Zealanders in general. But yeah, as a generational cohort, all these societies kind of look the same, especially now. They're really top heavy in the kind of silent and boomer generations. So pretty similar. No, again, I'm generalizing now. We'd have to go like country by country to like pick apart the statistics, but the trends are basically the same. All right. Yeah, please.
I have a question about the midterm. You guys said it on Wednesday, but the readings on the syllabus, are those all still the same that are going to be tested?
Okay, so it would only apply to kind of, so anything that has to do with families and education is off. Everything else is like fair game, but again, I'm always heavy on slides and lecture, and like I don't test on things I didn't talk about in the readings, right? Because I don't like that and I don't think it's fair. So it's whatever we covered in class up to this point. But yeah, like because I know my dates are now completely thrown off and I'm gonna have to do some major footwork to get back on track. But I could have tried to shove education or family entirely into one class, but I didn't want to do that. So
you have, I think it's TISCA chapter 3 and 4, but that's all families and socialization and education. So it wouldn't.
yeah, you don't have to worry about those. Well, you worry about those for the next midterm.
Okay.
Now we have to adjust. Yeah.
Just to clarify, you said bullet points were okay as well.
Of course, please, I love you if you write bullet points. You're my favorite person ever. I have to read so much for these exams. Bullet points are great. Don't sacrifice content at the expense of bullet points though, because they are fairly involved questions. Like if you can rattle off a couple things in bullet points, but make sure you're putting enough, right? Sometimes the danger with bullet points is you don't put enough to fully answer the question. So just like be careful with it and just think like, have I fully answered this question? Okay. Yeah.
How many words like do you want?
As many as it takes you to answer and not one single syllable more. I don't want to put, okay.
100 words?
I don't want to put limits on it. And very specifically for this reason, if I tell you I want 300 words per answer, you might have answered the question in 250 words and people will write that extra 50 words and they'll waste time writing 50 extra words or whatever. I'm not counting words, right? So you just need to answer the question, right? And when you feel like I have sufficiently answered this question, stop.
Is there like a minimum?
No, one. The minimum is one. You should write one word at minimum. Other than that, no. And because undergrads are so used to performative kind of academics, where it's like, I've told you to write 250 words, and you will write 100 amazing words and 150 words that are like word salad, because I told you to write 250 words. I refuse to give you a word limit on this. I will not do it. Once you've answered the question, move on. If it takes you 500 words to answer it, great. If it takes you, and again, I'm saying 500 words as an example. You don't need to write 500 words. If it takes 500 words, perfect. If it takes 180 words, that's fine too. I don't count, right? I could, but that's just another thing like, they didn't write they wrote 249 words. That's minus 0.001. Like I hate that stuff. It drives me bonky. So yeah. Other questions? No? Bueller? Sorry, that's a really old reference. That's like the most Gen X millennial reference of all. Is it just short answer? Yes. 5 short answer questions. Roughly 12 minutes per question. Maybe 13 if I generously like pretend that I could hold people off at the doors of the room that you're not going to be in. And I'm like, take 5 more minutes. Yeah, it's probably like, 12, 13 minutes a question. 5 questions. 5. Just short answer. It's 5 questions. 5 questions. How many times can I say? 5 questions. 6 on the final. 5 questions on the midterms. All right. Are we good? All right. Then we end 10 minutes early. If you have any questions over the weekend, email me. I'm super bad on the weekends. My life is super chaotic, but I will do my best to answer emails. And yeah, like I said, it'll be available midnight. So 0000 hours to 23:59 hours. Once you start, you have 60-ish minutes to do it. 5 questions. You can do it here if you want to come for class time, or you're free to do it from anywhere. Yeah, and if you have accommodations, I will email you today, just letting you know, but I will basically just add your extra time if you have accommodations. And I think someone has an audio accommodation. I have the files for you, which I will send you on Sunday night for the exam. All right, we will see you on Wednesday. You as well. Hello. I'm going to shut off my mic. Yes.
Well, you kind of basically just answered it because I was going to email you, but I have accommodations, but like I don't have to be like, because they usually, like I know you mentioned they usually give like a first room to like write in.
Yeah, like if you do it through, I think they're calling it DOS now or whatever.
Like,
You don't have to go through it. I've told them that I'm not requesting proctoring for this exam. So you don't have to go. You can do it from home or here or anywhere you want, where you can be, in a space that you're comfortable in for that amount of time. I've honestly just found that their proctoring has not been very good. They're like, oh, this student needs a quiet space, and they stick you in a room with 65 other people, right?
And I was just doing daily because I was like, it's like I don't know how often I'll use them. It's using for work. And then I remember using them all the time.
Yeah, it's unfortunately really degraded over what it
And then it was like, of course, as soon as I
so I've seized control of the means of exam production in true Marxist form, right? And yeah, so basically, as much as I can, I try to keep it out of their hands. And they've also done stupid things to my students, like cut them off, like before their time was up,
Yeah, for
because they
3 months,
apparently
I
don't know
think
how to
it'd
do
be
math.
like $95
Right. So it's just like,
even if I don't wear it,
yeah, do it at home. Your time, if you're on my accommodations list,
And like usually,
which I can check if you're nervous about it. I just add your time. Yeah. Yeah.
And then for the questions, will you be like pulling like questions from the textbook or?
In a limited sense, more from the slides. Like,
that I had, it was like
I would only use something from the textbook where it kind of corresponds with something I've also talked about, right? So you don't have to like plumb through the textbook, like desperately trying to learn every piece of material that I didn't teach you. Generally, like, I always think the textbook is like a good clarification. If you're like, I don't know what he's talking about, like, what is he talking about? And you can go there. Increasingly, this course is just like departing from the textbook, and I need like a month to sit down and like make a new reader for it and just get rid of the textbook, because I'm like slowly just like abandoning it over. They haven't revised it since 2015, and so there are a lot like the chapter on technology is laughably out of date, and which is funny because probably written in 2014, but so much has changed since then, right? They're like the Facebook, and it's like, yeah, okay. I think we're like way like social media has evolved. Even Facebook itself looks nothing like Facebook did in 2014. Right? Yeah, so I am departing ever so slowly from the textbook and just grabbing stuff all over. Like in this whole thing is like all from this one book by Twinkie, right? So yeah, you as well. More questions?
It cannot.
Maybe I'll answer their questions first. Hello. Okay, you're just waiting for her.
I'm the one with the audio.
So Sarah.
Yes.
Okay, I will share it with you like on Sunday night, early Monday morning, unless you're planning on doing the exam at like 7 a.m.
Yeah, no, that's too early.
I'll share it with you like early on Monday, and you can still write it at home and use it as needed. You'll have a different exam link.
Yes.
So I'll have it set up so it'll say like midterm 1 audio accommodations, and it'll be a fixed order exam, right? So like everybody else gets a variable order, you get a fixed order exam.
I know one of my profs just left it with the general ones, and all the questions are scrambled.
Yeah.
So that was a bit of a nightmare, but.
It would be. I've done these before, so I get the having to create a separate one. And what'll happen was when I mark yours, is I will take that mark, it'll be worth 0, but I'll copy that grade into the category for midterm 1, and then it'll look like you did it even though you didn't. So yeah.
Thank you. And you're going to post today's lecture, I'm assuming.
Yeah, it'll be on. Yeah, probably. So if I remember. Yeah. All right. No worries.
Oh, well, they just left me. That's nice.
Shelby's just waiting to.
Oh, he's waiting. Oh, yeah.
Bye.
Do you have a question?
No.
She's also in the CHRGC, so.
I have a question for that one.
Okay.